All right, practice 2.7, we're going to be looking at program design, thinking specifically about muscle actions. So again, we're building off each other. We're looking at periodization. We're looking at what's the big picture? How do we create a plan for a season? And then we begin thinking about how do we structure those individual workouts, and how do we meet the needs of our athletes. So we look at the program design. We're looking at kind of the common language. We look at the movement planes in the needs analysis, and now we're going to be looking at some of the muscle actions of our athletes in our sport. So again, this is covered in your book, but just to highlight some things here are the different muscle movement actions. And this is important to think about how we build muscle, right? How do we target hypertrophy, supercompensation, and really improvement in our sport, it's more specifically. So the three really things we focus on are concentric muscle contraction, isometric, and eccentric. So let me maybe just show you this in a little bit more detail here. I'm going to go full screen, and I'm going to show off some of my muscles here. I got some really heavy weights here. But the concentric action is what we tend to think about when we engaging in resistance training. I'm going to pull up my sleeve here. So the concentric action is when our muscle shortens against resistance. So the joint angle shortens. Okay, so this is my bicep or elbow flexion is causing the eccentric action, muscle shortening against load. So most of us think that's where the muscle building action occurs, but really it's on the eccentric action. So eccentric is when the muscle lengthens against resistance. That's where most of the muscle damage occurs, or it triggers most of the biological stimulus, right? That's where the muscle action is being broken down a bit, which causes inflammation, which causes the recovery response. It's mostly in the eccentric action. I'll show you a study with that, but you can also look that up. So concentric, eccentric, and then isometric is when the muscle is flexed with no movement. All right. So again, obviously we want to build strength in that full range of motion. Again, one of the pet peeves if I go into the weight room is two things, right? If someone's in the weight room and they're like, and they totally ignore the eccentric action. Another thing is maybe when people are lifting weights and they're just kind of repping it out, but they're not going through the full range of motion, right? We need to get that full range of motion for hypertrophy or strength among the whole range of motion. The other thing is the stretch shortening cycle. So again, we have to think about the demands of our sport. The SAID principle, specific adaptations to impose demands. So I might be struggling to lift weights here. Lifting it. Maybe more dramatic if I actually have some weight. Right? Lifting up here. But most sports, I'm not like struggling to lift a weight. If I'm a sprinter, right, or if I'm a runner, that's just, I want to create power, by moving those muscles quickly, generating force quickly, right? That's the stretch shortening cycles. The faster, more explosive you can contract and relax a muscle, the more power it will provide. So again, if I'm doing that bicep curl, The bicep is the agonist muscle. That's the muscle involved in, that's the muscle shortening against resistance. The agonist, right, there's multiple more muscles involved when my arm's out here, but when my muscle is lengthening against resistance, my agonist is the tricep. Again, I'm going to show off a little bit here, I suppose. So bicep is agonist. Tricep is the antagonist muscle. It's not really working against, but it's more in conjunction. So really, in order for the bicep, in this case, to be developed, we need to make sure our tricep is involved as well. So again, if we think about your sport that you are going to be focusing on in your portfolio, that you're either competitive as an athlete now or you want to be involved in as a coach, we have to think about those movements, those demanding in your sport. So again, here's just a breakdown of maybe that woman's golf swing. And I'm just picking at one of these positions here. So if I look at this position here, she's raising her arm. She's, right, that would be, okay, let's see, that would be internal, well, that is flexion, right? And we have some internal rotation as well, right here, with the golf swing. And that's primarily involved with my anterior deltoid, the front of my shoulder, right? So that, the anterior deltoid in this case, would be the agonist. That is involving a concentric action, right? Shortening against load. And then as I get to a certain point, I'm going to shift my swing, and now my posterior deltoid becomes the agonist, and then my anterior deltoid becomes the antagonist as I come through. So I need both the agonist and antagonist muscles to be involved in generating power for that stretch shortening cycle. So again, you think about your sport, what are the muscles involved? What are the muscle movements? How can you target those sport-specific activities so that athlete can improve in their sport? So these are just some examples there, right? This shows where those switch. So not only looking at the range of the types of muscle movement, what muscles are involved, but we can also think about range of motion in that stretch shortening cycle. Here we have a couple examples of pitchers. I know it's Tim Lincecum on the top, and I forget who's on the bottom, honestly, but that's neither here nor there. I just found these pictures of the different stages of pitching. Right, you can see how does that range of motion, how might that affect the power generated in those force angles. So again, we kind of think about, I grew up playing a lot of baseball, and usually if you choke up on the bat, you have more control over the end of the bat, right? And if you move down on the bat handle, you can generate more power that way. So it's kind of the same thing with range of motion. We tend to kind of shorten up to get more precise control. But that can limit the power of the force generated. So if we can get if we can generate force through a wider range of motion, right, that can create change the outcome of our sport. So ideally, right, we want to exert force through the widest range of motion possible without sacrificing accuracy. in preventing injury. So again, not necessarily have to memorize this, but this is a good rule of thumb, again, as you look at balance, posture, as we plan strength training for our athletes. So if we look at the different agonist and antagonistic muscles involved in movement, we want balance. And these are some typical ranges of balance. So if we think about trunk flexion, okay, my abs, that should generate the same amount of strength and force as trunk extension, like erector spinae. So if I can do 30 abdominal crunches, I should be able to do 30 back extensions. If we look at hip flexion, I don't know if I can get this in the video, right? But that's right, hip flexion and hip extension. That should be equal 1-to-1 ratio. If I look at knee flexion, okay, that's about 2/3 of what my knee extension can be. I don't know if you can see, right? You should be able to recall what knee flexion extension are, but basically if I can do 100 pounds of my quad leg extension, my hamstrings should be able to generate about 66 pounds of weight for knee flexion. I put in the brackets here ankle, that would be plantar flexion. So you're pointing your foot like you're going to be jumping. That can generate almost 3 times the amount of force as dorsiflexion. When you're, I don't know if you get that up here. This is dorsiflexion, that's plantar flexion. Okay, so I can generate 3 times the amount of power plantar flexion as I can dorsiflexion. So again, we want to look for those balances. Shoulder flexion, right here, and then shoulder extension. So I can generate more strength in that extension than I can with flexion. And then in the parentheses, internal rotation, I can generate more force, internal rotation, than I can external rotation. And then elbow flexion and extension, right, should be 1-to-1. So if I can lift 40 pounds bicep curl, I should easily be able to do 40 pounds with tricep extension. So in conclusion for this video here, let me try to animate this. Shift F5. I'm not sure if that's going to work here. These are supposed to be animated. Bear with me, I'm going to pause. Okay, so as we look at these, shoot, it's not animating again. But if I look at the bench press, what muscle's involved? What's the concentric and eccentric action? What's the agonist and antagonist? If I can do 200-pound bench press, what's the agonist? What's the other action? How much should I be able to do in the seated row? Likewise, right, if I'm doing the leg extension on my quads, what are the antagonistic, agonistic muscles? What's the muscle action? What's the eccentric, concentric action involved? And what's the proper ratio between leg extension and leg flexion? So those are some things as a professional you should be thinking of. You should be able to communicate to other professionals, i.e. in class. And those are some things we can be thinking of for your sport.